A young man walks into a philosopher's study, angry and certain of one thing. The world is unfair. His past has damaged him, and unhappiness is something that was done to him, not something he's choosing. Over the following nights, across a series of increasingly heated conversations that push back on nearly every assumption he arrives with, the philosopher takes that certainty apart piece by piece, using a school of psychology built specifically to argue the opposite. The result became one of the most quietly radical self-help books in years, precisely because it refuses nearly every comfortable assumption people bring into that genre. The book is The Courage to be Disliked by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga, structured as a dialogue between the young man and the philosopher, who speaks for the ideas of the Austrian psychiatrist Alfred Adler. Adler is often mentioned alongside Freud and Jung as one of the founding figures of modern psychology, but his ideas took a sharply different direction, and this book exists to make that direction usable, one uncomfortable argument at a time. The very first claim the philosopher makes is also the one the young man resists hardest, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. Trauma, in the way people commonly use the word, does not exist, at least not as a force that directly determines behavior. This isn't a denial that painful things happen. It's a rejection of the assumption that a past event causes a present feeling or action in some fixed, mechanical way. Adlerian psychology looks forward instead of backward. Rather than asking what past cause produced this present state, it asks what purpose the present state is currently serving. A person who avoids leaving their house isn't simply the passive victim of some earlier wound. On some level, often entirely unconscious, they have adopted anxiety as a purpose, because staying inside protects them from a risk they're not ready to face. The anxiety isn't a leftover scar. It's serving a function right now, in the present, and that reframing changes everything about how change becomes possible, because a function can be examined and revised, while a fixed cause from the unchangeable past cannot. The young man pushes back immediately, because this idea feels like blame dressed up as philosophy, as if the book is accusing people of choosing their own suffering. The philosopher's answer sharpens the distinction. This isn't about assigning fault for how you feel right now. It's about recognizing that you retain the freedom to choose your response going forward, regardless of what happened before. And that freedom is precisely what gets lost the moment you locate the entire explanation for your life in your past. If your present is nothing but the direct output of your history, then no revision is possible. If your present is instead an ongoing series of choices about how to interpret and respond to that history, then change, however difficult, remains genuinely available. From here, the conversation turns to a claim that becomes the structural foundation for nearly everything else in the book. All problems are, at their root, interpersonal relationship problems. Loneliness only exists in relation to other people. Feelings of inferiority only exist by comparison to someone else. Even a private struggle, worked through entirely alone, tends to trace back to some concern about how you're seen, judged, or valued by others. This claim reframes what personal growth actually requires. It isn't purely an internal project of self-improvement, achieved in isolation. It's fundamentally about how you're choosing to relate to the people around you. And much of what feels like private suffering turns out to be interpersonal in origin, even when it never looks that way from the inside. This sets up one of the book's most practical tools, something the philosopher calls the separation of tasks. Every problem, examined closely, can usually be divided cleanly between what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else. And an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering comes from failing to draw that line correctly. Whether someone approves of your choices, likes you, or is disappointed in your decisions is not your task. It belongs entirely to them, shaped by their own values, history, and expectations, none of which you actually control. Your task is simply to act according to your own honest judgment. Confusing these two tasks, taking on responsibility for how other people feel about choices that are legitimately yours to make, is where the philosopher locates a huge share of ordinary, everyday unhappiness. Consider how this plays out with something as common as a career decision, made partly to satisfy a parent's expectations rather than your own genuine judgment. The philosopher's argument is direct. Whether your parent approves is their task, governed by their own feelings, not a problem you're actually equipped or obligated to solve on their behalf. Your task is choosing the path that's honestly yours and living with the consequences of that choice. This doesn't mean ignoring other people or treating relationships carelessly. It means refusing to carry a task that was never actually yours to carry in the first place, which the book treats as one of the most direct paths toward relief from a very specific, very common kind of chronic anxiety. This task separation directly explains the book's title, and the claim underneath it is more precise than it first sounds. Freedom, in Adlerian terms, is the courage to be disliked, not disliked for no reason, and not as some perverse goal to pursue for its own sake, but disliked as an unavoidable, acceptable byproduct of living according to your own honest judgment, rather than constantly managing how you're perceived. If you organize your choices around avoiding anyone's disapproval, you have effectively handed the direction of your own life over to other people's opinions you were never going to be able to fully control anyway. Being willing to risk someone's disapproval when a decision is genuinely yours to make isn't recklessness. It's the actual exercise of freedom, and the book argues most people never experience real freedom precisely because they've never been willing to pay this specific cost. This same forward-looking logic extends to something even more immediate than trauma: emotion itself, particularly anger. The young man treats his own anger as something that simply happens to him, an involuntary reaction triggered entirely from outside. The philosopher challenges this directly, arguing that anger, in Adlerian terms, is frequently a tool, summoned in service of a goal a person has already decided on, rather than a force that arrives first and dictates behavior afterward. Someone who raises their voice at another person in a moment of frustration hasn't simply been overtaken by an emotion beyond their control. On some level, they've reached for anger because it's an efficient way to assert dominance or force immediate compliance, faster than a calm, reasoned conversation would achieve the same result. This doesn't mean anger is fake or that the frustration underneath it isn't real. It means the emotion is being used purposefully, even if the person experiencing it would never describe it that way in the moment. Recognizing this reframes the entire relationship a person has with their own emotional reactions, since a tool, unlike an involuntary force, can be examined and set down. The book extends this same logic to what Adler called a person's lifestyle, a term referring not to daily habits, but to the deeper, largely unconscious set of beliefs a person holds about themselves, other people, and the world, usually settled on quite early and rarely re-examined afterward. The philosopher's argument is that this lifestyle, however long it's been in place, was still a choice, made under whatever circumstances existed at the time, and because it was chosen once, it remains open to being chosen differently now. The book acknowledges directly why so few people actually attempt this. A familiar lifestyle, even an unhappy one, comes with the comfort of predictability, while choosing a new one requires stepping into genuine uncertainty. And uncertainty is frightening enough that many people quietly prefer their current unhappiness to the unknown risk of change. The philosopher names this pattern a kind of self-deception, a lie a person tells themselves to justify staying exactly where they are, and confronting that lie honestly, however uncomfortable, is presented as a required step before real change becomes possible. The book also directly tackles the instinct to compare yourself against others, framing it through the distinction between healthy striving and unhealthy complexes. Wanting to improve, to grow more capable than you currently are, is treated as a natural, universal part of being human, something Adler calls the striving for superiority, though the phrase means something closer to healthy aspiration than dominance over others. The trouble starts with what the book calls an inferiority complex, a state where a person uses their own perceived shortcomings as a justification for not attempting something at all, turning a feeling into an excuse rather than into fuel for genuine effort. A related distortion, the superiority complex, involves compensating for that same underlying insecurity by exaggerating achievements or status, seeking validation through comparison rather than through honest growth. Both patterns, in the book's framing, trap a person inside a vertical way of measuring their own worth, constantly ranked above or below everyone else, rather than simply moving forward at their own pace. That vertical framing gets challenged directly in one of the book's more counterintuitive sections, which argues against praise itself, at least in the way it's commonly used. Praise, the philosopher argues, is something a person in a position of relative power gives to someone in a position of relative dependence, and even when it's well-intentioned, it quietly reinforces a hierarchy, training the person being praised to keep seeking approval from above rather than developing their own internal sense of whether their effort was actually worthwhile. Encouragement, by contrast, is offered horizontally between equals, focused on genuine effort and contribution, rather than on judging performance from a position of authority. This distinction matters most clearly in how adults relate to children, but the book applies it just as directly to relationships between adults, arguing that horizontal relationships, built on mutual respect rather than ranking, tend to produce far healthier, more durable connection than relationships organized around who gets to approve of whom. This leads into what the book treats as the genuine antidote to the endless, exhausting comparison most people default to: contribution rather than competition, as the actual source of a sense of belonging and self-worth. Instead of measuring yourself against other people, the philosopher argues for measuring your own sense of value by whether you feel you're contributing something to the people and community around you, a feeling Adler called community feeling. This doesn't require external recognition or measurable success. Even a private, quiet sense that you're useful to someone, that your presence contributes rather than merely competes, is enough to satisfy the underlying need that comparison was always failing to satisfy anyway. Because comparison, no matter how much you win at it, never actually produces a durable sense of belonging. Contribution does. Near its end, the book turns to a final, almost meditative idea about time itself. The young man assumes life should be understood as a line, moving from a starting point toward some ultimate goal, with meaning arriving only once that distant destination is finally reached. The philosopher rejects this entirely, proposing instead that a well-lived life is better understood as a series of individual moments, each complete in itself, the way a dance is made up of individual steps, rather than a straight path toward a fixed destination on the far side of the room. This reframing directly targets the anxiety of an unfinished plan, the sense that nothing counts yet because the larger goal hasn't been achieved. If each present moment can be lived completely on its own terms, then a life doesn't need to arrive anywhere specific in order to have already mattered along the way. Every idea in the book, laid out together, points back to the same underlying claim that opened it. Your past does not lock in your present. The disapproval of others is not a debt you're required to keep paying. Comparison was never actually going to deliver the sense of worth it seemed to promise, and contribution, quietly and without an audience, usually does. Even the lifestyle you've been running on since childhood was a choice once, which means it remains available to be chosen again, differently, however uncomfortable that uncertainty feels. The courage the title refers to isn't recklessness, and it isn't indifference to other people. It's simply the willingness to live according to your own honest judgment in this specific moment, fully aware that not everyone will approve, and choosing to move forward anyway.